Okay, welcome everyone on this beautiful Sunday morning. Good to have you with us, including those of you on Zoom. Stuart Nixon, our very own Stuart Nixon, is with us today, and he'll be leading us in a 3-week discussion on how did religion come to America? Where does the narrative really begin? So, Stuart, welcome back, and we're looking forward to having you. And Tammy, thank you for being here too. Stuart's lovely wife. Please keep in your thoughts and prayers, those on the special concerns list and those in the military. And those of you on Zoom, please remember to keep your mics muted unless you're speaking, and type any questions or comments you have into the chat function. Just have one quick announcement. During worship today, we'll be celebrating our 20-year anniversary of supporting Henry Marsh Elementary School, formerly George Mason. So that'll be part of a worship service today. So please join us. Any other announcements, joys, or concerns to share with the class today? If not, Stuart, turn it over to you. Thank you, sir.
Well, good morning. Good morning. It's kind of strange coming back since I last taught the class. And of course, it's most gratifying to be invited back. That's kind of a positive sign of encouragement. So thanks for the good attendance and the good folks on the Zoom too. Well, I want to give a nod of appreciation to Pastor Amy and to her cohort, Earl Rohr, our good friend from Covenant class, who back in the J term led us in a discussion of Christian nationalism, if you remember. That's kind of set me off to get in focus about what I wanted to talk about today with you. If you remember, Christian nationalism is the case or the argument or the proposal that America has lost its way morally because it's lost its way theologically. And so, the argument goes, if we can only recover the roots of our religion as one nation under God, we could recover our moral values. That's the argument. If only we could get back to the faith of the founding fathers, that beautiful phrase, we all love it. If only we could recapture the faith of the founders, all of the nonsense that's going on, we could resolve. And as Amy and Earl pointed out to us, this has become a very strong message in our current political environment. In fact, it's resonating with a lot of Christians. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes. Well, anytime people start talking about the founding fathers, which happens to be a special interest of mine, I think, well, yes, we need to talk about theology, but we also need to talk about history, because nothing happens without context. Context precedes content. If you don't know the time and place of an event, there's no use to get all hot and lathered about the event, because you really are not getting it straight. So we need to go back, in my mind, and talk about context of Christian nationalism and the broader implications, which are what's the right way to go and what's the wrong way to go for our country. So what I've done is try to dig a little deeper and see if I can share some information that will help all of us think about where does Christian nationalism fit on this spectrum of religion in America. Now, whenever I talk about history, you'll remember from previous classes, if we do so in a thoughtful way, we study history, we go in quest of the past, we soon discover that there's not one kind of history. but two kinds of history. Now, what do I mean by that? I liken it to a coin that has two sides. Most coins have two sides. So there's the top side, and then there's another side. And let me see if I can show you what I'm talking about. History is a coin with two sides. The top side, number one, is the side you already know. We all know. You're all familiar with it. It's taught in schools. We take it with us into adulthood. It's constantly being discussed in the public square, in the media, because this is the big stuff. It's all the important events, the developments, the famous people, everything we need to know to have a foundation in our history. So it's necessary and it's important, and it's not all bad, a lot of good. But what happens when we take the coin and flip it? The first kind, to put it very simply, is the story of what happened. But when we flip the coin, I want to suggest that it's no longer the story of what happened, it's the story of what really happened. Oh, a little spooky maybe. If we follow this line of thinking, I'm proposing that we discover new insights and new perspectives and new understanding. Changes everything. So that's what I want to try with you. Now, the reason I'm making a big deal out of this, if we go back to number one, it seems to me there's this enormous temptation to engage in what I call reduction. What I mean is that history, or that variation of history, we start to chop it down and chop it down and chop it down until we're left with just a few brief passages, or maybe just even a headline on your little cell phone, or even worse than that, nothing more than just a clever little cute slogan. It's what I call soundbite history or bumper sticker history. If you reduce everything down to a bumper sticker, it turns out it's very effective communication. You can pack a lot of stuff into a clever slogan. It fits on a bumper sticker. And the reason is that your audience will react emotionally, not intellectually. They don't need to analyze it. They don't need nuances. They know instantly what you're trying to say from that bumper sticker or that soundbite. It actually makes, I'm going to be the first to confess, soundbite history, bumper sticker history makes great politics because it's so effective as a form of communication. But there's a problem. It makes terrible history. You just don't want to depend on bumper stickers for your history. To illustrate this idea, I want to stop talking in the abstract and I want to get very specific with you. Very specific. Because I can do a better job of explaining it than I can. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story. And it's a story you already know. Well, you think you know. I'm going to tease you a little bit. I'm going to tell you another variation, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's the story of the Scopes trial. Everybody's heard of the Scopes trial. You know all about it. 1925, state of Tennessee, a little town called Dayton. When it happened, the news reporters, remember now the context, news reporters, newspapers were the big deal. That's how you communicate. News reporters said this was the trial of the century. And they were right. It was a national phenomenon when this happened. We're still talking about it. Aren't there good Christians today invoking this as evidence of that great clash between the good guys and the bad guys, between the devil and God? It serves beautifully that function. I have, one more thought. When we say the Scopes trial, and I asked you for images in your mind, you may think about that movie, Inherit the Wind, which was released in 1960, where they reenacted the entire trial. And that most of those scenes were set, not surprisingly, in a courtroom. This beautiful old courtroom with the paneling and the judge at the bench and filled with spectators and so forth. Wonderful image, very vivid image. I haven't gone there. I've picked for you a different photograph from the Stokes trial. The reason the trial was so prominent, or the primary reason, not the only reason, but the primary reason that the Stokes trial became what it was, two very famous men got involved in the trial. The first was William Jennings Bryan, an attorney, well known all across the country, a very conservative man, a very forceful man, a very capable man. He came in as head of the legal team for the prosecution. The other guy was Clarence Darrow, also an attorney, also well known. He came in as head of the legal team for the defense. Their presence guaranteed this thing was going to explode from a little country courthouse to the entire country. Now, if you look very carefully at the picture, I'm going to put the cursor here. This gentleman seated in the white shirt and the bow tie, that's William Jennings Bryan. Okay? Now I'm going to go over here, standing up, looking at Bryan, is Clarence Darrow. What's going on? What's going on here is that Bryan has been called as a witness to testify on behalf of his knowledge of the Bible. And he's being interrogated by Darrow as to whether he really knows the Bible, like he says he does. You'll also notice something very strange about this picture. There's no courtroom. In fact, it's not even an interior shot. This is outside somewhere. What in the world is happening here? Back to what really happened. The trial lasted 10 days. On the 7th day, back to context, notice where and when the trial is being held. It's the middle of summer in the South. The judge said on the 7th day, it's just too darn hot. We're going to go to the lawn. He moved the whole trial to the outside, and you can see it there for yourself. And in the background, this is a little fuzzy back here. You can see all the spectators. They're all out there watching. And Darrow and Bryan are going to have no trouble speaking. They are orators. They can reach everybody on the lawn. Okay? Now, I've got to give you, before I tell you what happens next, I've got to give you more context. I know I'm belaboring this. Here's what you need to know in way of background. Dayton, Tennessee, in the mid-1800s, is not much more than a crossroads, just a little crossroads in the middle of nowhere. But then something magical happens, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The railroad comes to that part of Tennessee. The railroad in that time period now, 1800s, was like superhighways. That's the way you moved. That's the way you traveled, whether it was you personally or it was the product you were shipping or something else. But that was the big deal. If the railroad came to your town, thank the Lord, praise the Lord, good things are going to happen. And that's exactly what happened to Little Dayton. It blossomed. Suddenly, remember the time period now, post-Civil War, the South is still hurting, but not the North. So everybody who was interested in business wanting to reach into the north, because that's where the population was, that's where the money was. You wanted to bring in investors from the north to expand your local economy. And that's exactly what happened to Little Dayton. Suddenly, business was booming. I'm not giving you some examples here. There was a big mining operation which was set up in the county. This is Ray County, by the way, Tennessee. Dayton is the county seat. There was a big blast furnace. There was a hosiery mill. And finally, let's not forget the good farmers. The farmers suddenly had new markets because they specialized in berries, primarily strawberries. Everybody loved Dayton's strawberries. In fact, if you go there today, wait until they're having their strawberry festival, because they loved their strawberries and they will want you to come and enjoy their strawberries. Well, suddenly Dayton had this whole new northern market to sell products and strawberries and other berries. So it was good news. But that was followed by bad news. The blast furnace had to shut down, and the remaining businesses could not make up the revenue, the lost revenue, by themselves. So suddenly what started out to be really good collapsed. This little town was in bad shape. And I've given you an example here, a statistic. In the gay 90s, the last decade of the 1800s, the population of Dayton was about 3,000 people. Once we fast forward to the Scopes trial, the 1920s, you can see there were only 1,800 people left in Dayton. Business was shuttered, people were moving. So the town fathers really had a grim situation. But then something happens. Something every bit as miraculous as the railroad. What was it? Now, watch the dates here. This is important. March 13, 1925. Tennessee's General Assembly passes a law called the Butler Act, because Mr. Butler introduced the bill, prohibiting the teaching of evolution in the public schools. Now, I want to introduce you to somebody, and I put his name here, George Rapelier. Rapelier. You think it may be a Dutch name, I'm not sure about that. I didn't research that. Who is George Rapelier? You've got to know about this guy. In fact, I'm going to encourage you to go home and get on the internet and look him up. He is a fascinating character. A heck of a good career as an engineer. He engaged in projects all across the country. I'm cutting past all of that. You can look it up if you like. I'm going to tell you lots about him because he is a key figure in this whole story. Let me just quickly, I'll give you something to look at here. Here he is. I call him Architect of the Apes. Now, why do I do that? Because George Rapelier invented the Scopes trial. It was his idea, and I'll tell you how that happened. May 4, 1925, we know the exact day that this happened. Rapelier picks up his morning newspaper, and an article jumps off the page at him. It's about the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, headquartered in New York City, where Rapelier was born and raised. So he was naturally interested in what the ACLU was doing. The ACLU said, if we can find somebody in the state of Tennessee who will challenge in court this new law, you notice it's only 2 months now, from March to May. If somebody will challenge the law, we will pay the legal bill. Why? Because we think this is a dangerous precedent to set, whereby teachers can be told what they have to teach. That's what's called a lack of academic freedom. It doesn't matter what the subject is. Could be evolution, could be something else. The point is, you don't want to set that precedent. The ACLU could see that possibility. You don't want to tell a teacher, well, you're not allowed to teach that. You only teach this. So they said, if we just find a volunteer to go to court, maybe we can nip this thing in the bud. So what does Rappleyea do? Well, he does what any of the good old boys in the South do. He goes down to the local watering hole to shoot the bull with his buddies. And the watering hole in Dayton happens to be the drugstore, owned by a man named Fred Robinson. Everybody knows good old Fred with his drugstore and his famous soda fountain. Now, you all are old enough to know that every drugstore has to have a soda fountain in the South. And you know what's served there. I don't even know what they drink down there. Anyway, so that's what he did that morning. Goes down to the drugstore, and he says, hey guys, have you read the morning newspaper? Because I have an idea. Oh. They said, well, yeah, of course we've read the newspaper. Everybody reads the newspaper. Well, what did you think about that story about the ACLU? Oh, we didn't read that. What? We didn't read that? Oh, let me tell you. I think there's a possibility here for us. I think we could piggyback on this. If we can get a trial going, if we can volunteer to be the setting of the trial, and we can persuade the ACLU to do it in a little tiny place like Dayton rather than in the big city like Chattanooga or Nashville. Imagine the publicity. Imagine how we can reach all of those news reporters out there and have them come into town and see this great place called Ray County, Tennessee. Maybe we can turn this local economy around thanks to the press. Now you might think, oh, this guy's nuts. Dayton, Tennessee, and they could go to Chattanooga. Well, he said, are you willing to think about this? Well, actually they were, because the town was desperate. And they said, well, maybe. So they all agreed to think about it, because let's face it, every southern town has a couple of lawyers. So yeah, we can put together a prosecution, we can put together a defense. So we'll think about it overnight. And they all come back on the next day, the 5th of May. And they say, yeah, this is a possibility. But we have got a little problem. We don't have a bad guy. Who are we going to accuse of the crime of teaching evolution? Now you'll notice here that good old Fred Robinson not only owns the drugstore, but he's chairman of the local school board. He's in a perfect position to help facilitate this whole thing. Here we are. Here are the good old boys. I don't know if you can read all of that. Anyway, so the first thing they've got to do is call the ACLU to say, would you be willing to, we think we can do this, would you be willing to back us? And the ACLU says, fine, we like it, go ahead. Okay. But now, they got the okay from New York, but they don't have a bad guy. So what are they going to do? Here's what happened. Great story. It happens that the Ray County High School teaches biology. And they actually have a teacher who's the biology teacher. And they actually have a textbook which includes a chapter on evolution. And the textbook is required reading. The teacher doesn't get to choose. the teacher is forced to teach evolution using that textbook. But it happens that that time frame when evolution was mentioned in class has passed. And on those days, the biology teacher was absent from school. I can't remember what happened. Doesn't matter. So the administration of the school had to find somebody to teach the class. So they turned to the physics teacher, who also happened to teach math, and he helped coach the football team. He was a great guy, nice guy named John Scopes. The problem was he didn't know anything about biology. But he said, okay, I'll be the substitute. So he actually taught biology, evolution. So the good old boys at the drugstore said, okay, let's go find John Scopes, get him in here, tell him what's going on, and see if he'll agree to this little conspiracy we've got going. Now, I've got two sources on this part of the story. The first source says that when they found Scopes that day, he was playing tennis. The second source says, doesn't say anything about him playing tennis before the drugstore. It says after he talked with him at the drugstore, he went back to play tennis. Doesn't matter. Maybe it was both. Doesn't matter. The point is, for you and me, that this was very amicable. There's nothing sinister going on here. Nobody's mad at anybody. This is all very friendly because they all like this idea of staging a trial. So, he called in Scopes. And oh, by the way, they softened him up a little by giving him a drink from the soda fountain. And then they said, here's the deal. What do you think? And he said, well, I'm kind of curious about this evolution thing. Sure, I'll do it. So they had everything they wanted. So the next day, all the good guys from the drugstore got on their telephones and called every news reporter they could think of. Yonder, far yonder, local, whatever. That's why it hit the press when it happened. Because these guys were good at drumming up the listen as a result of the little conversation with the drugstore. Okay, now, here's John Scopes. Everybody liked John Scopes. He was a nice guy, only 24 years old. And he'd only been at the school a little while. Here he is, 1920s, dressed very properly. And here is him posing with Applegate, the two gentlemen, the two key figures in our story. Now, let me get to where we need to be. Okay, you know how this thing exploded. It's a great contest between good and evil. Let me give you a little bit more background. This is the 1920s. The 1920s were a time frame when you were lucky to be alive because the world was turning upside down, technologically. This was when, for example, private homes began to get electricity. Early in that century, there's hardly anybody with electricity. Imagine what life was like when you knew the government was now going to help put electricity in your home. And if that weren't enough, this is when automobiles became easily available, even though the roads were terrible. Everybody could now buy an automobile. They were cheap. Remember Henry Ford? And we also had the birth of the airline industry in the 20s. Another radical change. Oh my goodness. We also had, I didn't put it in here, but this was when radio stations started to go on the air. And finally, not to forget, Hollywood. This was the birth of Hollywood in the 20s. Imagine living at that time. What a change. Why am I telling you this? When you get technological changes on this massive scale, you also get moral challenges, moral questions moral change, and it's scary. So the institutions in American society that were responsible for morality have to do something. And the first thing they did was prohibit the sale of liquor. That opened up the Jazz Age with illegal booze, the dance craze. Remember the dance marathon? And last but not least, let us not forget the rising hymn lines. Oh my goodness, rising hymn lines. So the church had to respond. And evolution just lent itself so easily to this whole moral climate, as did prohibition and a bunch of other things. Okay. Now, let me, another illustration, another photograph from the Scopes trial. T.T. Martin, you can see his name up there on the banner. T.T. Martin was a famous evangelist, very, very conservative politically, theologically. He rented space in front of this store outside the courthouse to sell his book called Hell and the High School. He was vehemently opposed to evolution. And so he wanted to have lots of his books stacked on the tables out there. And you'll notice, I'll put the cursor on it, there's a little sign here that says Bryan's Books. That would be William Jennings Bryan's books. So you can see why this thing just took off. Now, why am I talking about the Scopes trial? We have here, quite unexpectedly, a cautionary tale for you and me and for Christian nationalism as one of the many political movements touching on religion in America. We're still fighting the Scopes trial. The feeling today about evolution is every bit as contentious, as fiery as it was a century ago. We're almost at the century mark for the Scopes trial. And this whole concern about the devil at the door is alive everywhere we look as we speak. Here's an article from the Washington Post dated April 29. That's only what, 3 weeks ago? The article says that the Senate in Texas is considering 3 bills. They've actually passed 2 of the 3 in there, but they're considering all 3. Bill number 1 says that in Texas, the 10 Commandments must be displayed on the walls of the school. It must be displayed in a prominent place where all the students can read the 10 Commandments. Bill number 2 says that every public school must set aside time for prayer and for reading the Bible. And bill number 3 says there must be a chaplain in every school to make sure the law is enforced. So we now have the state and religion, if these bills pass, like this. Texas wants to apparently lead at the cutting edge here. So has the Scopes trial shut down? I don't think so. And there's a quote in here that somebody is naturally going to say, well, wait a minute, what about Thomas Jefferson and separation of church and state? One of the backers of these bills says, separation of church and state is not a real doctrine, which is exactly what the Christian nationalists are saying. So, back to the question, do we have a cautionary tale here? When we get to the subject of the migration of religion in general, and Christianity specifically, from the old world to the new. How far back in time do we have to go to find the beginnings of the faith of the founders, historically? What does the historical record tell us about that pathway? Can we even connect the dots? Is it right? We don't know. That's what I want to try to do here. We need to ask the question, how do we get here? Because that brings us right back to questions of religion and state. I'm going to start us at a place that I'm guessing you have not the faintest idea, and you're going to be very surprised. Because remember, we're talking about the flip side of history. I want to start with the Wars of the Roses. I think I'm safe in saying that no matter where you go today, the internet, talk radio, even the pulpit, the pundits, the commentators, doesn't matter. When they get to talking about the faith of the founders, they're never, ever going to talk about the Wars of the Roses. But I think we need to do that. And here's why. The Wars of the Roses occurred in the late 1400s. Catch the time frame here, the late 1400s. The founding of the U.S. occurred in the late 1700s. From the 1700s to the 1400s is 300 years. That's a long time. We got a lot of ground to cover. So maybe Stuart doesn't know what he's talking about. Isn't this kind of a reach? Well, I'm going to put the evidence on the table and let you decide. The Wars of the Roses were literal wars. They were violent. They were civil wars in England between two very important noble families. The House of Lancaster, who chose the red rose for their symbol, and the House of York, who chose the white rose for their symbol. What was the fight about? Well, it was the biggest of the big. It was who was genealogically entitled to the throne of England. Who was the rightful king and who was the impostor? Stakes are about as high as they get. It looked like the House of York was going to win. But then the unthinkable happened. King Richard III got killed in battle. And suddenly there's a vacuum at the top. Who is going to get in there? The Yorks or the Lancasters? What happened, another twist, was that some of the people fighting on the York side got disillusioned and said they were going to defect to the Lancasters. And that's what happened. Suddenly, a family of the House of Lancaster, called the Tudors, the House of Tudor, or not the House of Tudor, the family of Tudor, found they had some defectors on the other side. And so together they all came, they managed to win the Wars of the Roses. Richard III dies, the vacuum is filled by the Tudor branch of the Lancastrians, and suddenly there's a new king, Henry VII, the seventh person with the name Henry to become king. Henry VII, I don't want you to ever forget this name, because we're going to talk about it. One way he got the crown, smart guy, he said, well, if you'll come over to my side, I will marry a York woman. And he did. He kept his promise. Notice the dates here. From the death of Richard III in 1485, the next year, he didn't waste any time, he married Elizabeth, Lady Elizabeth of York. Thus begins, this is where we get the dynasty of the Tudors. We already know how important that dynasty was. But I'm going to tell you some other things. Do we need to stop for any questions? Because I've given you a lot of Okay, I'll keep going a little bit more. Okay. Here they are, Henry and his consort, Elizabeth of York. Don't you love these old portraits? You know, scholars study these for every little stroke of the brush. Right away, what did the artist have in mind? Why did he pick that color and that pose and all of that? Let me see here, where do I want to go? Here we go. Okay. Henry VII has a good career. He has a good reign, unusual, right? 24 years, for goodness sake. And I've listed some of the things he did. We don't have to get hung up on that. But he also does, as strange as this is going to be, he also does not one thing or two things, he does 5 things that are relevant to our story. 5 things. I mean, this can't be, right? What in the world could he have done that we need to know about? Well, here we go. Number 1. This is actually not what he did, it's what he didn't do. History often turns on omission rather than commission. You have to be sensitive to that. He was approached, the crown, Henry VII was approached by a sea captain from Italy. I've given his Italian name here, Bartolomeo, who said, I'm Colombo, his last name Colombo. He says, I'm not here for me. I'm coming as an agent for my brother, Cristoforo Colombo. Now, I've put the English here, of course, because you know who I'm talking about. Bartholomew Columbus, and the brother is Christopher Columbus. My brother has a great idea. We all know the globe is round, the earth is round, but we're sick of going east from Europe to go get the spices from Asia. We think if we go west across the water, we'll get there quicker. So it's quicker and it's cheaper to get the spice that everybody in Europe wants from Asia. But we need money. Would you be willing to sponsor a western voyage to Asia? What does Henry VII say? No deal. Now imagine what that means for you and me. Where does good old Christopher go? To one of the superpowers of Europe, Spain. And he gets a yes. History changes, paradigm shift. Everything turns upside down because he got the money from Spain and he heads west. Henry VII had the shot at it first and he messed up. That was number 1. Now, number 2, we know what happens when Christopher Columbus bumps into land, and it ain't Asia, nowhere near, right? But what does that mean for merry old England? Well, they ain't so merry, because they have been shut out of the action. Spain now takes over, dominates the New World. And also Portugal happens to manage to wedge their way in, and they get a piece of the action. Very quickly, very quickly you can see. Now remember, Europe is all Catholic at this time frame. Everybody's a Catholic. The Pope steps in and says, well, I'm going to make sure that the church is there. So he takes a map, such as it is, and draws a vertical line of longitude and says, okay, everything to the west of this line belongs to Spain. and everything east of the line belongs to Portugal. Now, is that fair? Well, let's think about this. It turns out, of course, the Pope had no idea what he was doing, but he put the line happened to put the line in a place where everything east included modern-day Brazil, which is huge. If you compare the acreage of Brazil, you almost can take the entire 48 United States and stuff them in to Brazil. So Portugal did not get hurt. Okay? So Spain and Portugal take over. And little England has got its nose pressed up to the glass, going nowhere. Except the day arrived when another seafaring captain from Italy shows up. You can see a Giovanni Caboto. Go, Giovanni Caboto, whose name we know as John Cabot. And he says the same thing. He says, I want to go west, but I'm going to do the smart thing. I'm going to go in the northern latitudes because it's shorter. If you take the north route, it's shorter than the southern route to get to Asia. I can beat Spain at their own game. Well, Henry VII isn't stupid enough to make the same mistake. This time he says, yes, I'll build you your ship. I'll build you your ship and I'll finance the voyage, get you your crew, go get some land for England. Can we stop there? I'll tell you what happens next week. Don't forget John Cabot. There's more to be said. Any questions? No? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. See you next week.